My name is Byron Johnson. I direct the Institute for Studies of Religion here at Baylor University. I want to thank you for coming to our last lecture of the academic year. We've had more than we've ever had, and including 3 last week. And we are delighted to have with us today Congressman Ernest Istook. Ernest has an impressive resume, and if you read his bio, which is in the program today, you'll understand. He's coming back home. He's a Baylor alum, and maybe, I think, one of the only speakers we've had this year that actually attended Baylor University. And he's practiced law, so he's been in the private sector, and of course he's been in government service for many years, or I guess some 25 years, 14 years in Congress from Oklahoma, and more recently, he has his own radio show in Washington, D.C., which we were talking about a little bit earlier. So he's had an unusual amount of exciting experiences, all of which I think will be prime for us to hear about today in this lecture. And so, and there'll be Q&A at the end of his talk. So join me in welcoming back to Baylor Congressman Ernest Istook.
Well, let me make sure I wasn't clear. Everybody in the back who can hear very well, wave your hands like this. Okay, just wanted to be certain about that. Good. Now, it's always nice to be back at Baylor, and originally they told me we were going to be in Armstrong Browning Library. I was really looking forward to that because I always like to see Pippa. And, you know, there's nothing like passing by Pippa to put yourself in a good mood, to know that everything is where it should be. And I always remember the first class I ever had in Armstrong Browning Library, and it was really rough because it was an 8 a.m. class, and that's tough to get up there. But it was the first classroom I ever had with stained glass windows. And I remember that one of the windows there in the room where Professor Constantine taught had the image of a bird and Robert Browning's favorite line, his famous line, "Oh, to be in Waco, now that April's there." I think it said Waco. Maybe it was "Oh, to be in England," but it was April. I'm sure about that. Now, not everybody appreciates what an excellent education Baylor provides for people, but of course it does. But I do have a suggestion of how you can inform the world about the excellence that Baylor provides, and that's simply to have a campaign comparing before and after what Baylor accomplishes for people. And if you look at some of the information that you get at Baylor from incoming students when they matriculate, and you find different ways of, getting from essays or different pre-placement examinations and so forth, I have a selection for you of some of the befores. These are from some of the actual submissions sent in by people who have now graduated from Baylor, but when they were first seeking admission, you can tell just how much improvement was needed. For example, checking on their knowledge of social sciences, one of them wrote this: "Ancient Egypt was inhabited by mummies, and they all wrote in hydraulics. They lived in the Sahara Desert and traveled by Camelot. The climate of the Sahara is so bad that its inhabitants had to live elsewhere." And another from the history: "Eventually the Romans conquered the Greeks. History calls them the Romans because they never stayed in one place for very long." Of course, there's lots of involvement with the arts. One of the essays submitted said Beethoven wrote music even though he was deaf. He was so deaf, he wrote loud music. Beethoven composed music until he died, and then instead he decomposed. And today, although his music still lives, Beethoven is still dead. And from some of the science applicants: "When you breathe, you inspire. When you do not breathe, you expire. H2O is hot water, and CO2 is cold water. When you smell an odorless gas, it's probably carbon monoxide." Think through that one. 3 kinds of blood vessels are arteries, veins and caterpillars. And finally, when planets run around and around in circles, we say they are orbiting. When people run around in circles, we say they are crazy. Well, I think you can tell that Baylor actually, had a lot of work to do with these particular students. They arrived at Baylor as underdogs. Now, the nice thing about that is when you're an underdog, there's no place to go but up. Now, you might have wondered, why did he choose to speak about underdogs? Well, I think it's because nothing really tells the story of America so much as the story of underdogs and the story of personal triumph over difficulty and adversity. And it's something that it means something to me in my own life as well. Our country began as a ragtag group of colonists who thought they could take on the mightiest military power on earth. Not everybody agreed. In fact, about a third of colonial America stayed loyal to Britain and to King George III. The situation became so bad at Valley Forge that in the winter of 1777, General George Washington, wrote this to the Continental Congress: "I am now convinced beyond a doubt that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these three things: starve, dissolve, or disperse." Now we know none of those three things actually happened, but that's the way that George Washington looked at that situation in the winter of 1777. Yet by 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown, Washington prevailed, and the British surrendered against all odds, and with some help from the French, not to mention from the Almighty. The Americans won their independence. Declaring it back in 1776 was the easy part. Winning it, of course, was the hard part. Many battles have been fought and won against long odds. We had the English against the French at Agincourt in 1415. Everybody studied that, right? You still study the Battle of Agincourt? Right, okay. You had the American ice hockey team against the Russians in 1980, okay? And of course, we had Baylor against Oklahoma in 2011. I remember as a young man being inspired in 1961 when President John F. Kennedy proclaimed, "America chose to do things not because they were easy, but because they were hard." And that included his expressed goal of sending a man to the moon and safely bringing him back before the end of that decade. And, it inspired me. I decorated my room with planets and rocket ships. And sure enough, we accomplished that feat in 1969. And I've always believed, I don't know who said it first, I think it's credited to Goethe, but dream no small dreams, for they have no power to move the hearts of men. America, of course, has always been about dreaming big dreams. Today, however, we're often told to downsize our dreams in different ways. There's many aspects of it. Your generation is often told, well, you're just not going to have it the same way. Now, I recall this was before he became president. I recall attending a speech that was given by Bill Clinton, where he said, well, this next generation is the first one that is concerned they're not going to have things as good as their parents had had. Now, that was 20 years ago, and we're on to another generation since then. And there are lots of things, and I'm not here to give you a whole litany of examples, but there are all sorts of ways where we're told that America should be downsizing our expectations. Now, I know that leaders such as President Obama try to avoid saying those words explicitly, but nevertheless, those are the circumstances that are often presented to us. And, despite record spending and record debt, so much spending goes to meet individual needs rather than collective needs. Individual things, health care, food stamps, public assistance, rather than shared national needs. Now, to give one concrete example, our military. Now, I'm not proposing that we go in and send our troops to the Ukraine, but the old standard for our military that was just changed a year and a half ago, the old standard that was the doctrine for the Pentagon was that our military had to have the capability of fighting 2 full wars in different places on the globe at the same time. The new standard is we have to be capable of fighting a single full war while just trying to do a holding action of some sort someplace else. That is the new standard that is being applied to our military. It makes a big difference in our capabilities. It makes a big difference in how we're seen by the rest of the world and whether or not they are willing to do things that they might not have been willing to do before when they thought the United States had the level of military might that we no longer have. So the result is military adventurism. We're seeing it in Ukraine. We may see it next in Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. We may see it other places in the world. We may see it from China, which has designs in other places too. The result may be, even though it does not reach us here in our homeland, the result may be more disruption in the lives of millions of people around the world. Once, everybody in the country believed in American exceptionalism. Now we believe in American generosity, but ask about whether he believes in American exceptionalism. If you didn't hear President Obama's answer a couple of years ago, President Obama said, yes, I believe in American exceptionalism, and I'm sure the British believe in British exceptionalism, and Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism, and so forth. That's all based upon whether you are just sticking up for your home country and nothing else. It's common for people to believe that America is in decline. I think there's certainly been American decline, but here's the key. It's not irreversible. And I think there are many people who tell us that it is, and I don't believe that. Let me give you some of my background. Now, a lot of people wonder, what kind of name is Istook? You probably never met anybody else named Istook. I know a couple of people here have. But my father's parents were immigrants from Hungary. They came to the USA from Hungary seeking the land of opportunity. The area from where they came is no longer part of Hungary, however. It's now part of Romania. Perhaps you've heard of the region from which they came. It is real. It is not make-believe. They came from Transylvania. I am, by blood, half Transylvanian. It is real. That's on my father's side. My father's father was a gardener. My father was a small businessman. The other half of my family tree on my mother's side is just good old American melting pot, especially cotton farmers who generation by generation moved across the South, making their way through the generations from Virginia to Texas. Now, to me, it's always been significant that I am the first college graduate anywhere in my family tree. That means a lot to me. So my degree from Baylor means a lot to me. And then it means a lot that all 5 of my children have college degrees. And in addition to bachelor's degrees, we have a couple of master's degrees and a PhD in there. And cheering for the underdogs has always been part of my life. Now, that came in really handy when I was here at Baylor. My years at Baylor overlapped for 5 football seasons. Let me tell you what our record was the 5 football seasons that I was here at Baylor, okay? 1-8-1, 3-7, 0-10, 2-9, and 1-9. 5 years, 7 wins. As I left Waco Grant Taft was pulling in. And I moved to Oklahoma City, and this was in the days before ESPN and before the internet, and it was hard to watch or keep up with the games, but you know, I was really excited when the Bears started winning. And when they'd go on the road, even place, you know, taking on Southern Cal and Los Angeles and beating them, and I would be constantly trying to tune in distant radio stations to keep up with how Baylor was doing. And it was such a joy to have my underdog Bears, the doormats of the old Southwest Conference, winning. And year after year, that went on. And then, guess what? Grant Taft retired, and the Big 12 was formed. And there I am in Oklahoma, right? Okay? Do you know what it's like not just to have to contend with teams like the Sooners, but to be there in the Big 12 year after year after year? And do you have any idea what it was like to show up in Norman for football games wearing green? I got so much sympathy. And I remember one time Baylor was going to play the Sooners in Norman that week, and I was having breakfast with G.T. Blankenship, who was the chairman of the Board of Regents of University of Oklahoma. And I said something about, well, I'll be there in Norman, of course, cheering for the Bears, and G.T. just kind of had a pained look on his face. And he said, well, can't you just, pull for the Sooners against the Bears just this one weekend? And I said, G.T., if you can't trust me to be true to my alma mater, how could you trust me on anything else? And he understood that, but he didn't worry about it. It was Baylor. It was the underdogs. But the whole situation with Baylor football reminds me of what Richard Nixon said. And he said this as a president who went back and forth between triumph and tragedy, and ultimately, of course, resigned office in disgrace. But he said, only if you have been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain. And to have Baylor football, as well as other sports, resurge again. 4 bowls, Big 12 title, Heisman Trophy for Robert Griffin III. Some of you have only been at Baylor when the Bears were winning. You weren't with Baylor as underdogs, but it means so much. And I think of that when I think of what's happened with America. Up, down, and the need for America to return to some of the places it needs to be. Because right now, around the world, America is seen as slipping, or within our borders so much, America is seen as slipping. The next generation gets stuck with the national debt. National debt of $17.5 trillion, the average interest that we're paying on the national debt is 1.9%, okay? 1.9%. If interest rates go up a single percentage point, how much more do we have to pay in interest each year? Quick, somebody. The answer is $175 billion if interest rates go up by a single percentage point. That's a lot of money, just if interest rates change by a single percentage point, much less 2. That's how precarious the situation is with the national debt. We have a situation with half the children born in the country out of wedlock, 50 million people on food stamps. Even though we have 31 million more people than we did in the year 2000, there are fewer Americans working. We no longer have a AAA credit rating. And do you know, for over 10 years, 60% or more of the country says America is on the wrong track. That's a long time for people to feel that way. On the other hand, 30% of the country say we're on the right track. The other 10% I don't think are sure what country they're in. We have disability claims growing faster than jobs do. Some headlines I just, picked up. There's lots of them out there. A story that says 20 signs America's in decline. Signs of decay in America. Warning signs of America decline. Comparisons to Rome. Wayward kids in Nazi Germany. All sorts of stuff. And I'm disappointed. The president told a reporter, well, I'm against balancing the budget just for the sake of balance. Can you imagine saying that to somebody? I'm against balancing my checkbook just for the sake of balancing it. Or I'm against being honest just for the sake of being honest. Or anything else. Is virtue still its own reward? This is just a little bit of the, looking at some of the challenges. But, I believe in underdogs. My life has been spent as that. When I ran for Congress, I didn't know this at the time. There was a poll out there. You know what my support was when I ran for Congress? 3%. But I won and the others didn't. I know about overcoming odds. When I ran, well, even before that, when I ran for the state legislature, I took on someone who was a sitting member of the Oklahoma City Council and a former police chief of Oklahoma City. I was the big underdog there. When I got to Congress and I wanted to get a seat on the Appropriations Committee because it had a chance to work on all sorts of issues, and it was the first time, and I got it. It was the first time in 20 years that any Republican freshman had gotten a seat on that key committee. There are all sorts of ways that we can take on difficulties in life. And I just want to say some things to you about where do we look and how do we look to overcome the challenges that we have as America. And I think it starts off with never get angry. I see so many people and I hear them, and being involved in talk radio, I hear all sorts of people that they're just constantly angry. Now let me tell you the difference. When something goes wrong and somebody does something that they deserve to be called upon, express your righteous indignation. Do that, but express it and then stop. Don't carry it over into being angry about everything. Some people think that just because you have the right to be indignant about something, that therefore you should be angry about everything. It is not the same thing at all. And I think too many people treat them as the same thing. And instead it causes a lot of people just to tune out and not pay attention to what you're talking about. If you want to change the world, don't approach it with anger. Be indignant when you should be, but don't approach it with anger. Next thing, for goodness sake, study. I want to tell you this situation right now that's going on. You've heard about this rancher out in Nevada. Who keeps up with the news enough that you know about the rancher out in Nevada? Not that many people, okay, but some of you do. A lot of people on talk radio and such are treating him as a hero. He's not a hero. Neither are the government officials that are using overkill to try to move his cattle off the land. But he has been told over and over by courts that he's in the wrong, he's exhausted his legal remedies, and he still won't obey what the courts have told him. The problem is, instead of bringing in court officers to remove his cattle, which would be the U.S. Marshals, the government agencies are trying to do it themselves and making people think that it's a bureaucracy out of control rather than the courts trying to enforce the law. A lot of people just aren't paying attention and studying what the facts are in that. It's just an example of people not learning what's going on before they spout off about it. Next thing, if we want to reverse the course of the country, if we want to put America back on the sound footing that it should be on, don't just go around talking about such and such is in the Constitution and this is all about freedom and liberty. Tell people what they can do with that freedom and with that liberty. Tell people what they can accomplish for themselves and their family if they have the freedom to go out and do things themselves rather than being dependent upon government or held back. Don't just talk about abstract notions of freedom and liberty. Talk about, of course, self-reliance that way, but for goodness sakes, be humble. Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, gave us an example of needing to overcome the odds. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We were tested then. We're tested today. We will never stop being tested. We will always be tested to see if we are going to live by principles, to see if we can overcome the temptations of taking money out of the federal treasury for ourselves or spending it on this generation and sending the bills to the next generation. We're always going to be under one test or another. It's nothing new. Don't think that suddenly something has happened in this generation that never happened before. Abraham Lincoln saw that. And Ronald Reagan, when he was inaugurated as president and inherited a load of problems, domestic and foreign, we had hostages being held in Iran. We had an economy that was in the doldrums then. And what Reagan said to the people in his first inaugural address, can we solve the problems confronting us? Well, the answer is an unequivocal and emphatic yes. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, I did not take the oath I've just taken with the intention of presiding over the dissolution of the world's strongest economy. He talked about people that had sacrificed their lives. And he said, now, the sacrifice we're called upon to make is not that heavy, but it does require our best effort and our willingness to believe in ourselves and to believe in our capacity to perform great deeds, to believe that together with God's help, we can and will resolve the problems which now confront us. After all, why shouldn't we believe that? We are Americans. Now, does that make a difference? Do we believe that there is something distinctive and different about being Americans? And if we believe that, are we willing to live up to the challenge of being something distinctive and different, to stand on higher ground and to act that way? You know, I find that part of the problem is we take some sacred things for granted and we treat them tritely. And one of my pet peeves, as it were, is that every political speech today ends with people saying, God bless America. Now, I'm a believer in saying God bless America, but I'm a believer in meaning God bless America, not just throwing it in to be trite and just saying it because it's the thing to say, because you expect it, and somehow people think, oh, you know, he's a believer because he said God bless America. Almost every politician closes a speech by saying God bless America, but the words have lost meaning and impact too many times. It no longer is an affirmation, a reaffirmation of the impact of faith on America's founding and in our everyday life. You know, once those words were an echo of what we find in the Declaration of Independence, the most famous portion of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now reflect on those words. First, they speak of the inherent equality of every soul. Now, that means we get an equal start, not an equal finish. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be, 5'10" and weigh 175 pounds and have brown eyes and brown hair and drive a Ford Focus and whatever, okay? Doesn't mean you have to have 2.3 children and eat at Applebee's every Friday. But in saying that all men are created equal, it says we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Where does it say our rights come from? They're endowed by our Creator. They don't originate with government. They originate with God. We're endowed by our Creator with these unalienable rights. And government exists to secure these rights. That was a noble and novel concept, and people just skip right over it. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So when we say God bless America, hadn't he done that already? Hasn't he done that already? So I think just saying God bless America is about as trite as saying, how are you doing? And then you don't pay any attention to what's said in the answer. So I think that if we want to be more than underdogs, if we want America to come back, we've got to be humble enough to not just say God bless America. We've got to understand God has already blessed America. And I think what we need to do is say, yes, God bless America, and he already has done it. I think we have to be saying it's time that America should be blessing God. Now, isn't that what we ought to be saying and doing and remembering? That we ought to have that gratitude. We ought to have that appreciation. We ought to have that humility, because that's what it takes to be able to overcome the situation that we're in. There's no limit, I believe, there's no limit to the capabilities of how this country can rebound. The natural resources, the people, as challenged as it is, and believe me, I can carry on at length, and I do it on the radio all the time, about the challenges we face, but never lose track of the optimism. Abraham Lincoln said, "Look for the good, and you will find it. Look for the bad, and you surely will." It is always easier to be a pessimist. It's always easy to find fault. It's not as easy to find the good, but it is out there. And America gives us so many ample opportunities to find the good and to do the good. So I simply leave you with this challenge, and that is to be a source of good in America. Be a conduit for the things that you and I and everybody here have inherited. And take the wonderful opportunity of being an underdog, because we were an underdog to begin with. Then we became the big kids on the block and in the world, and now we're slipping back into underdog status. But that's okay, because we can overcome it. Because after all, as Ronald Reagan said, we can do that because we are Americans. I think we can do it because God has blessed America, and now it's time for America to be blessing God. Thank you for letting me take time to be with you. And I'm at your disposal if there are Any questions or discussion? Yes, ma'am.
What would you anticipate being the biggest obstacle for our underdog generation?
What's the biggest obstacle for the underdog generation? I think the biggest obstacle is willingness to engage. Okay, I work at church with people in their 20s, and it is so easy to say, I'm going to have all the time in the world to address things. Right now, I want to enjoy the wonderful opportunity to be young, to have friends, to do all these things, and it's such a wonderful time of life. So I think it's the willingness to engage at that time and stage of life that is the biggest challenge. Yes, sir.
At a time when that's not as common, I mean, there are now different methods for college students to become engaged in the political
Sure.
arena. It's not as overt as it used to be. So how can they become more engaged?
How can people become more engaged? Okay. The first challenge is being sufficiently informed, because right now, propaganda is every place. Trying to get a straight answer to even simple questions is excruciatingly difficult. And you'll get convoluted interpretations and ways of expressing things as percentages of this and that and the other. I'm not going to give you all sorts of examples, but believe me, it's out there. You have to look at a multitude of sources. And if you do that, you know, if you look at some places like compare what you might see on Breitbart with what you see on Huffington Post, for example, and you'll find that it looks like they're saying totally opposite things, which means now you have to figure out, are they totally lying, or are they just trying to manipulate the way that they say things, which means you've got to study and figure out what's behind it. It's that kind of research. It's tricky, it's tough, it takes time, but then once you find out who is trying to fool you, you learn a lot from that process. So you just have to go lots of different sources. It is not easy. You can start off saying, I'm going to trust everything that comes from this particular source, and if you pick the right one, that's great. But you'll not learn near as much in the process as being comparative. Other people? Is that a hand up or is that a head scratch? Okay. Be careful. Don't go to auctions. All right? Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you for spending time this afternoon together. I very much appreciate it, and just great to be with you. Thanks.